Welcome to this place called Earth and the project Somatic Inversions, Behavioural Manipulations. In this short, the isolation reflex, why manipulators pull you from co-regulators. We explore and expose the mechanisms that shape behaviour beneath awareness. When you're pulled away from the people who steady you, every human nervous system relies on co-regulation, the ability to stabilise through safe people, safe faces, safe rhythms. This isn't emotional dependence, it's biology. When manipulators isolate you, they aren't removing friends, family, or support systems. They are removing the nervous system cues that protect you from them. The most dangerous part. They rarely do it all at once. Isolation begins as a whisper, a suggestion, a feeling, a sense that it's easier when it's just us, or they're not good for you, or they don't understand what we have. But beneath the language is the real tactic. They are removing the people who keep your nervous system regulated, the subtle pull away from your anchors. In relational manipulation, the process often begins quietly. A partner gives you a look when you mention a friend, a subtle sigh when family calls, a comment like, they don't treat you right. You're different when you're with them. They're the reason you feel stressed. They don't appreciate you as I do. You think it's a concern, but the body feels the truth first. Your chest tightens, your breath shortens, your world begins to narrow. They aren't removing people. They are removing your co-regulators, the individuals who keep your vagus nerve calm, your thoughts clear, and your identity intact. Attachment disruption. When they become the only safe harbor, manipulators often create attachment monopolies. They induce fear, then offer relief. They destabilize, then soothe. They withdraw, then reappear with warmth. This creates a trauma-bonded loop documented by researchers like Jennifer Freyd and Patrick Carnes. 1. Distress leads to sympathetic activation. 2. Relief leads to parasympathetic drop. 3. The manipulator becomes the only source of regulation. Once this loop is in place, anyone who disrupts this monopoly is framed as a threat. Your nervous system becomes dependent on the very person destabilizing it. That dependency is the isolation reflex. The friend group that gets quietly discarded. Many victims in domestic abuse cases describe the same pattern. I stopped seeing people. Not because I wanted to, but because it felt easier not to upset them. Isolation doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like a relief from pressure. But what you're actually losing is your connection to nervous system clarity. When safe people disappear, your body loses its reference points. Your sense of reality begins to tilt. Your intuition becomes muffled. Isolation shrinks the world until the manipulator becomes its center. The group that replaces your external world. Cults and high-control groups rely on isolation as their primary mechanism. In Jonestown, NXIVM, and Heaven's Gate, leaders used communal living, strict inner circles, emotional loyalty tests, restricted contact with outsiders, secrecy, and us-first narratives. The purpose wasn't to control information. It was to control regulation. If you remove a person's co-regulators, you collapse their defenses, their perspective, their critical thinking, and eventually their identity. The group becomes the only available nervous system, and therefore the only available truth. When governments and corporations engineered isolation, lockdowns became a global isolation mechanism. The COVID lockdowns created one of the most significant involuntary isolation events in modern history. Regardless of politics or intention, the physiological impact on human nervous systems was the same. We removed co-regulators at scale, the very people who keep us sane, grounded, and emotionally stable. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a full disruption of the mammalian safety system. We as humans regulate through familiar faces, predictable voices, shared routines, rhythm, proximity, and presence. When those vanish, the nervous system enters chronic threat activation. But what made this event so profoundly destabilizing wasn't only the isolation, it was what filled the vacuum. Fear became the replacement for connection. During lockdowns. People weren't simply alone. They were alone while being bombarded with fear. Every notification, every headline, every broadcast, and every statistic was a drip feed of hypervigilance. Psychologists note that when fear is presented without the ability to act or co-regulate, it induces freeze states, dissociation, cognitive dissonance, attachment shifts, and dependency on the source of perceived safety. This is basic behavioural conditioning. Induce fear, restrict movement, collapse social support. Present the authority as the sole provider of safety, and for millions, it worked exactly as nervous system science predicts. The timing was not neutral. It was strategic. Lockdowns were often announced late at night, with minimal warning, following spikes of fear-based messaging, and during periods of heightened uncertainty. This amplified destabilization, emotional overwhelm, confusion, and obedience reflexes. Behavioral scientists have documented for decades that major restrictions imposed during peak emotional arousal produce higher compliance. The world witnessed this in real time. Isolation created vulnerability. Fear created dependence. Dependence created obedience. Families broke along the nervous system fault lines. Because co-regulation was disrupted, families could no longer stabilise one another. We saw siblings sever communication, parents and adult children turn on each other, partners split over policies, and friendships collapse over differences in threat perception. This wasn't political disagreement. This was a nervous system incompatibility created by prolonged isolation. When the body is locked in survival mode, logical dialogue collapses, empathy shrinks, nuance disappears, the brain interprets differences as danger, and a connection becomes impossible. Millions weren't fighting about the virus. They were fighting from dysregulated body states, and dysregulated bodies don't debate. They defend. The moral anchor inversion, obedience as virtue. People were told, if you go outside, you're selfish. If you see family, you're killing the vulnerable. If you question restrictions, you're dangerous. These statements reframed connection as a threat and isolation as a moral duty. This is classic moral inversion used in behavioural manipulation. Convince people they are virtuous only when they act against their own needs. Co-regulation, our primary source of emotional survival, was reframed as harm. Obedience became kindness, isolation became heroism, compliance became moral superiority. And once morality becomes part of the behaviour loop, cognitive dissonance locks it in place. Corporations remained open, community structures did not during lockdowns. Small businesses closed, community centres closed, places of worship closed, mental health supports closed, and relational hubs closed. But large corporations stayed open, online platforms surged, major retailers expanded tech infrastructures, tightened their influence. People lost access to human-scale relationships and were funneled into institutional-scale systems. This is not a conspiracy, it's simply what happened. And the somatic consequences were profound. Once the nervous system collapsed, relating became impossible. After long-term isolation, many people experienced irritability, hypervigilance, social anxiety, emotional overwhelm, perceptual distortion, diminished empathy, black and white thinking, unregulated anger, and mistrust of others, which means two people trying to connect were often two dysregulated nervous systems colliding. No amount of logic can bridge a gap created by chronic fight, chronic flight, and chronic freeze. Because once the nervous system is in collapse, communication becomes misinterpreted as a threat. Arguments exploded, relationships ended, whole communities fractured, not because people changed ideologically, but because their bodies could no longer co-regulate each other. The ultimate isolation reflex, a world that could no longer relate, the global collective, experienced a prolonged period of fear with no relief, isolation with no support, uncertainty with no anchor, authority-driven dependency, division framed as morality, identity tied to obedience, and human contact replaced by digital noise. This was not just a public health event. It was a nervous system event, and the world is still living inside its aftershocks. When co-regulators disappear, people become easier to control and harder to connect with. The isolation reflex didn't just divide families, it divided humanity. Vagal deprivation. The nervous system starves co-regulation, activates the ventral vagal system, the branch of the vagus nerve responsible for safety, clarity, empathy, perspective, stability, and relational intelligence. When manipulators isolate you, they deprive you of this neurobiological nourishment. Without co-regulation, the body shifts into hypervigilance, exhaustion, confusion, dependence, emotional collapse, and submissive compliance. Your nervous system becomes hungry. And they offer themselves as the only source of food. The inversion we were taught. Don't lose your friends over a relationship. Stay connected. Isolation is a red flag. Healthy people encourage independence. But the inversion is deeper. Manipulators don't just isolate you socially. They isolate you physiologically. They remove your co-regulators, so your nervous system becomes dependent on them for safety, clarity, and emotional balance. Isolation isn't about control of space, it's control of your state. So to close this short, when they attempt to cut you off from the people who steady you, they gain access to the parts of you that only safety should ever reach.